Hey everybody, welcome to Citizen by CNN. I'm Christine Romans. I'm the host of Early Start. You have to get up early to see that, 5 a.m. to 6 a.m. Eastern time, where we sort of start CNN's programming for the day. And I'm also the chief business correspondent. And I'm really delighted to be moderating this afternoon a discussion about inflation, jobs, and the economy, and what it all means heading into the midterms. You can see on your screen with me Paul LaMonica, Phil Mattingly, and Vanessa Yurkevich. All of them have been covering different angles of this week as we're heading into just 50 some odd days until the midterms. This is a super important topic, both, of course, for your pocketbook, for your investments, for your portfolio, and for your vote, right? So we're going to dig into all of it. And also, of course, we want to be answering your questions as well. So bring those questions in. We've already got a few on deck. But I want to start with Paul LaMonica first. The big story this week, inflation rearing its ugly head again. Or actually, maybe it never really stopped roaring. When you look at, I have this chart for you, you look at consumer prices and you look at producer prices, two new pieces of data we've had over the last 24 hours. You know, that consumer price number, the bottom line kind of freaked everybody out. The top line, though, not quite as bad. Paul LaMonica, the state of inflation is fill in the blank.
Not going away anytime soon, unfortunately. And I think that's the problem. There had been a lot of hopes that all of these rate hikes that the Federal Reserve has already done would start to show a more tangible impact on consumer prices and having them come down. And while some prices, notably energy, have been cut recently, which is good news for consumers, you haven't seen things like food and other very important consumer items. The price of there hasn't gone down nearly as dramatically. And, in some cases, they're still going up pretty sharply. So I think that is causing alarm bells among consumers and investors as well, because now all of a sudden you have people talking about the Federal Reserve potentially raising rates by a full percentage point next week, which is something that, Christine, you and I know they haven't done in the modern era, which is, pretty much since you and I have been reporters at CNN.
I know. I mean, it is really shocking. Just what they've done so far is dramatic. I haven't seen that since the early 1990s. You mentioned those grocery store prices, eggs up 39%, flour up 23%. This is year over year, 17% more expensive for milk. So Phil Mattingly, I mean, I felt like the falling gas prices was a tailwind for the White House and for Democrats heading into the midterms. But anytime you're going to the grocery store, or even paying your rent, these inflation numbers are still a problem. What does that mean for the White House?
Look, it's a huge problem, and it's one they've obviously been keenly aware of now for the better part of a year. And I think one of the hardest things when you talk to White House officials, particularly on the economic team, is that there's no real roadmap here at this point, right? When is the last time the economy has been coming out of a once-in-a-century pandemic? How do you tie things together? What are the indicators you're looking at? And what is the traditional trajectory that should be followed in this moment? And there really isn't one. If you look at the street reaction yesterday to the CPI report, that tells you everything you need to know. Wall Street was also expecting a much friendlier report in terms of inflation deceleration, not just the White House. And so I think what you see right now is a very complicated dynamic. And yesterday was actually a beautiful window into that, where you had the president on the South Lawn with thousands of people there holding a celebration for really the cornerstone legislative achievement, aptly termed the Inflation Reduction Act. At the same exact time, there's a split screen moment where the markets close and they're down 1,300 points, which is kind of how they're grappling with this right now. Inflation's not going away. Their hope is that it decelerates. Obviously, gas prices being down consistently over the course of 90 days is a central point for them. But the reality right now is this is a major problem. The question becomes if people feel like there's progress. I'll just say one last thing, and I'll stop ranting at you, Christine. There is a line inside the White House right now when you talk to officials who point to Reagan in '84, not Reagan in the midterms, but Reagan in '84, where obviously coming off a major significant inflation crisis, still kind of in the midst of one, inflation was still, I think, above 7% around election day. But it had a trend line just consistently downward. And that's what they're looking for, right? They want trajectory and they want to be able to point to the fact that things are getting better. If they no longer have the ability to say things are getting better, that is a major problem and very much undercuts the progress that they believe has been made and a rather steady economy and a number of different other factors.
Yeah, and a very strong job market, which we'll get to in a minute. But in this whole soup, now, Vanessa, enter the possibility of a rail strike. 30% of America's goods are travel by the rail lines, and it hasn't happened yet, but already you're seeing Amtrak, for example, suspend some, long haul routes because they don't know exactly what's going to be happening on those rail lines, and already orders of things that are, for example, chemicals and things that you can't have sitting on an empty rail track. Those have already stopped. So where are we on this rail problem?
Well, this will no doubtably be unwelcome news for both the administration and the American people if this happens, because we're already in a moment, as Phil and Paul have mentioned, of still grappling with high inflation. So if this rail strike goes through, if this happens, which so far there's not a lot of movement on both sides between the unions and the rail lines. That's why they were called to Washington, D.C. right now. That's why Secretary of Labor Marty Walsh has them in a room right now. There's no end to negotiations today. They're not saying we're ending at 5 p.m., everybody goes home. I mean, the administration is really trying to get a deal eked out in this sort of 11th hour, but this will undoubtedly be a problem for the economy. I mean, if there are no conductors, no engineers running these trains, the trains are not moving, and they carry everything from auto parts to ethanol, which is used to make gasoline, to food, crops that farmers are growing that need to get to processing facilities to make Cheerios and bread. And if that's not happening, prices on gas, prices on food, retail goods, and as you mentioned, commuter lines are going to be impacted because a lot of the nation's commuter lines actually share freight lines. And if the freight trains aren't moving, the commuter trains are not moving. So that is going to really play into sort of this readjustment of the American people once again, trying to figure out how to get around, trying to understand why their costs are starting to go up. Now, I just want to point out this is not going to happen, days into this strike. If it does happen on Friday, it's going to be a week or longer after that we'll really start to see these economic impacts. But no one is loving that this is happening right now, and certainly everyone is holding their breath at the moment.
One of the things that's a sticking point here, the different kinds of unions that work for the railroads, but you have these conductors and engineers who are, their rostering system, they're on call basically 7 days a week, right? And I feel like we're entering a moment, and I guess I'm going to put this to Paul, where we have a very tight labor market. And for the first time, certainly since I've been covering business news and the labor market, the worker has the upper hand. 2 years out of a pandemic, we have seen the quiet quitting, the great resignation, people who have the means to retire or step back are doing that. And guess what? Those happen to be engineers and conductors. And we have a labor issue that's here, not just labor unions, but we have a very tight labor market, Paul.
Yeah, that is a good bit of news, obviously, for many Americans who have probably for decades been longing to have a little bit more of an upper hand with regards to negotiations with their employers. But of course, that is a problem for the American economy in that wages have risen dramatically. And that is, of course, one of the issues that is fueling all these inflation pressures. It's not just wages, obviously, it's also some of the supply chain snarls that we've had globally over the past year coming out of the pandemic. And that has led to higher prices also. But I think that is one issue that you don't want to be glib and say, wouldn't it be nice if people weren't making as much money, because then inflation wouldn't be as significant of a problem. But in some respects, the fact that wages have gone up this sharply, it is a conundrum, to use an old word that Alan Greenspan, former Fed chair, was fond of, for central bankers right now. What can you do in this environment other than raise rates sharply, which probably will lead to a slowing economy? And to some respects, the Fed wants the economy to cool, but they don't want the housing market to collapse. No one wants a 2008 type scenario where banks have bad loans on their books all of a sudden, and we're talking about Great Recession 2.0. But if things go on like this, the economy inevitably would overheat, and that could create even bigger issues that no central banker can solve.
Yeah. You bring in the maestro, there's another former Fed chief, Paul Volcker, who had to really crank up interest rates to try to, break the back of stagflation. We should point out, and Phil Mattingly, the White House has done this many times when, we talk to the White House economic team, both on the record and off the record, that the U.S. consumer balance sheets are much better today than they were before the 2008-2009 crisis. There's just no question about that. And all that money in COVID that prevented a depression that now might be sloshing around and helping, fuel this inflation. A lot of that money is still in the pockets of American consumers and their bank accounts. So the American consumer is in a much better shape today with all of these uncertainties. Am I right?
Yeah, look, contrary to popular belief, two things can be true here. One, the economic recovery in the wake of the pandemic has been so dramatically better than it was in the wake of the Great Recession in terms of the limits of scarring, the long-term implications for the economy, people's ability not just to get back to work, but as you noted, their credit card balances, what's in their bank account, an entirely different place. And yet, some of the assistance that was sent out, particularly I'm thinking of some of the stimulus checks, are an accelerant or have been fueling at least some element of the inflation increase. I think the interesting thing when you talk to White House officials here is this complicated political balance that they have and messaging balance, which is acknowledge the fact that when food prices are where they are right now, that is a real problem for real people that they are experiencing every day. And you cannot ignore that, and you cannot act like you don't see it, and you can't act like you're not trying to pursue policies that would address it. Another element of that is it's the Fed's purview, right? The White House isn't signing a bunch of major new stimulus short-term spending legislation at this moment in time. That's the Fed's job. So what can the White House do? Well, what the White House can do is point to the legislation they've enacted up to this point that has given a pretty significant buffer coming out of such a significant downturn that we probably have. There's a lot of historical precedent for. Whether or not that resonates with people, I think, is the big question. Because when you look at the numbers right now and you look at people's views of the economy, the short answer is it's not really resonating.
Yeah, it's not. Vanessa, you've talked to and done so many packages, as we call it in TV land, right? We call them packages. When you go out in the field and you talk to people about their financial situation, you try to tell their story. And I've been watching you tell those stories. And I'm struck by a couple of things. The lack of childcare workers, the lack of good pay in childcare, which prevents people from getting childcare, which prevents more people, especially women, getting back into the labor force, which then would, of course, help solve this problem of a too tight labor force. Tell me a little bit about what people have been telling you about what it's like paycheck to paycheck on the front lines.
And I think in that package that I did about childcare, I use the term vicious cycle because that is what it feels like for so many women in these childcare predicaments. But, I think we're at a moment where people are just trying to understand what's going on. We're talking about the economy, we're talking about inflation, we're talking about jobs, but at sort of a basic level, people are really trying to understand why it costs so much more to send their children to daycare, but why the daycare workers are not making, as much money as they should be, and that their wages are not sort of rising in line with inflation and what it costs to send their children to daycare. I mean, they're really just trying to make sense of it all. And they're sort of looking around thinking, well, who's going to fix this? And a lot of what I talk about with them is who are you looking to? And they don't really know who to look to. I mean, as Phil mentioned, there's not a whole lot the president can do except for, messaging about different bills he's passed. When you try to talk about the Federal Reserve, that seems just so out there for folks because they want to be sort of listened to and helped in the moment. They want to understand why their $60 budget at the grocery store that they used to have is now buying them less. They want to understand why they are having to ration filling up at the pump. And I think it's just this delicate balance between just trying to get through the day, but also understand, how they can rebudget and make it work for their family.
You know, and Phil, I think it's interesting because the White House has been trying to take a victory lap on some of this legislation, but the things that Vanessa and I are talking about right here, expanded child tax credits, that was something that was meant to put money in the pockets of those families, right? To help them. The president wanted in Build Back Better. He really wanted to have universal pre-K, for example, which would help with this, and investments in childcare. So on the one hand, the president's trying to point to legislative achievements, but on the other hand, things that he couldn't get through are still a burden for American families right now.
Yeah, it's so fascinating, and I concur with you on somebody who's watched all of Vanessa's pieces, because it's really easy in the world that I live in to not think of it purely through policy terms or purely through legislative or
You mean Washington
negotiation
can be
terms.
out of touch? Is that what you're saying?
I mean, I don't want to speak for the entire town. I'll just speak. No, yes, absolutely. But
Not
you
you, Phil,
recognize.
not you.
No, thank you, Vanessa. But one of the most fascinating things, and you totally get at this here, is the critical elements that fell off the president's cornerstone legislative achievement were the care piece, which was both home care and child care, was universal pre-K, and was the child tax credit, expanded child tax credit, which, oh, by the way, if you look at the census data from yesterday, helped cut poverty in half, essentially, for child poverty in half, and is a demonstrably and unequivocal dramatic effect, and yet it wasn't able to move through. And so if you're the White House, you're saying, look, we got prescription drug prices, ability to negotiate on prescription drugs. When you talk about the most significant and dramatic climate investments in the history, not just of this country, but in the entire world in terms of dollar for dollar basis, these are serious wins for them that Democrats have been pursuing for a very long period of time. But when you're looking in a very acute manner about what's harming individuals in the current economy most, some of the most critical components of this plan fell off and just didn't have the votes. And that's political reality, that's policy reality in Washington, D.C., but that is a very tough reality to grapple with when you're the people that Vanessa's talking to every day.
Let me bring in a question because we're starting to get a few good questions, and keep them rolling, everybody. But I might have you take this one, Paul. David in South Carolina said, I recently read the cost of shipping containers has dropped 70% since January. If so, when will this drop be reflected and factored into the cost of items on our shelves? I mean, my gut reaction is the inputs in shipping and in the supply chain have been so screwed up for so many. We're just still trying to find an equilibrium here. What do you think, Paul?
Exactly. I think it will take, unfortunately, more time for some of these massive declines in some of those input costs to wind up being reflected when you go to the store or when you're buying something from Amazon or your other favorite online retailer of choice if it isn't Amazon. The problem, of course, is that shipping is just one component of the price of many consumer goods. And as we saw in the CPI report yesterday, that led to that massive, nearly 1,300 point slide in the Dow yesterday, plunge in the Dow. Food prices are still up sharply. A lot of other commodity costs are going up very dramatically. So even though shipping costs are down and oil and other fuel prices have come down, it's not as if everything is going down in lockstep. So there are just so many components that make up the cost of whatever you're buying at the supermarket that it's going to take a while, I think, for consumer prices to come down. And also, there are a lot of legitimate questions and concerns about companies needing to protect their profit margins. I mean, Phil, you joked about Washington not being in step. Neither is Wall Street with reality. A lot of times you have Wall Street cheering bad economic news and being upset about good economic news because what they think it might mean for inflation and the Fed. You have that to a certain extent with corporate America and earnings as well. Stocks, investors in stocks want to see profits go up. And how do you do that? You try and keep pace with rising costs. And that sometimes means higher prices for goods that consumers may not necessarily be able to afford or be willing to pay in a tough environment like this right now economically.
Let me bring in this question to you, Phil Mattingly, from Joy in Ohio. Joy asked this: what plans are in place to bring jobs back to America and to keep the ones we have already? This is a question I've been hearing really for decades, but it's kind of flipped upside down right now. I mean, I don't know what you're hearing, but I'm hearing business leaders start to say, we need to talk about immigration because we've got 11 million jobs open in this country. We have a whole cohort that's retiring, especially in nursing and in engineering and in education. And we need more workers here, not more jobs here, more workers here. Phil, what is the scenario here?
Yeah, look, let's start with the baseline that Joy lives in the best state in the country, and that is important.
That's where I am.
But speaking, yes, and Vanessa's there currently. I'm sure.
And it's not Iowa. I'm from Iowa, and you used to drive across the I-80 bridge, and there was a zipper sign that said, "Welcome to Iowa. If you're looking for Ohio, turn around."
Basically, yeah. The difference is we score points in football games. But that was me. I'm sorry. But, okay, to the actual question. So there's two elements of this, right? Like there's the broader kind of 30,000 foot policy question, and I think immigration is where you immediately head when you're looking at one of the major drivers. Major might be a little much. A critical component of what we've seen in terms of the employment picture right now. There is no question. If you talk to, and Christine, you do it every single day. Vanessa, Paul, you guys do as well. You talk to anybody in business, immigration is such a central component of this. And it is such a kind of, to their minds, like a low hanging fruit. We have to address this. The fact that we aren't is absurd. Let me tell you from Washington, D.C., it will not be addressed, and it will not be addressed anytime soon. And we could do 6 hours as to why that's the case, but I'm just telling you right now, it is not on anybody's policy front burner at the moment. One of the interesting things, and I mentioned the Ohio tie because I was there last week with President Biden as he was opening a major Intel factory in just outside of Columbus, Ohio. There has been a reshoring that we've seen, and I know you guys have picked up on it, Christine and Paul, in terms of jobs at a level that we have not seen in a long time. And where I'm going up with this is some of the legislation that has passed Congress and it's had like an immediate effect, not just because of money being shot out from the federal government, but also because its ability to incentivize private business, both to invest and to expand existing investments that will create thousands of jobs here in specific communities in Texas and Ohio, other places, is there has been a transition in terms of how some businesses are looking at the United States, the incentives to actually build here, the incentives to hire here. Now, that doesn't match up the scale of the kind of deficit right now when it comes on the employment side of things, but it's an interesting trend line that, Christine, I don't know if you've ever seen where we had, I think, a couple 300,000 jobs reshored over the course of the last year or two. Yeah. And I think that was a number that was kind of like, wait, whoa, okay, well, that's interesting. Why is that happening? And so to the extent that trend continues and the extent that there's policy ideas that can help accelerate that trend and or maintain that trend, I think is an interesting element as we all wait for people to get it together on immigration.
We've all known, I mean, for years we've reported on the concerns in Washington about the national security implications, frankly, of not having, your chip making abilities here close at hand. And then look, we had a pandemic where suddenly you can't get stuff. You can't get important stuff to build things like fighter jets, right? And so, and plus you have rules about what where the sourcing for those fighter jets. So we've found that we really do have to double down on that, reshoring some of those critical pieces. And I think for the first time in my career, I took a pandemic for anybody to get really serious about it. I'm going to go to Tony in Georgia right now. A question there, thoughts on the housing market and any advice to home buyers? I'll give this one to you, Paul and Monica. I mean, the housing market has rolled over from that big, huge, just clearly bubble it was in, but I don't know where it goes from here. What do you think?
Yeah, it is a very difficult question, Christine. And obviously, this is going to sound a little trite and cliche. A lot of real estate professionals talk about how the housing market isn't really a national market, but a series of local markets. And in any individual market, you are going to see prices higher than they might be in other geographic areas. But I think one thing that isn't necessarily changing, and you are starting to see, I think more and more workers really clamoring right now, not necessarily just for higher wages, as we've all talked about, but more flexibility. The pandemic has taught, I think, a lot of companies and workers that if you are in particularly a white collar job, someone like me who writes stories and goes on TV, I'm not in a factory and I don't need to be. Yes, it's great when I'm in the office. I'm here today, I'll be here tomorrow, but I can work from home 2 or 3 days a week and still be as productive, if not more so, kids and pets notwithstanding, because I don't have a commute that I have to worry about. And I think that is something that more Americans are going to demand, that they have that type of flexibility. And I think that's something that is going to be, critical, and that will be, I think, key going forward.
Yeah, we're in the early innings of these companies telling people they got to come back, physically at least 3 days a week, some 5 days a week. And I don't know what the numbers are going to show, but there are a lot of people who say that's just not going to work. That's just not going to work for them. And they're more productive at home, and they don't want the 10 or 8 or 10 commutes a week. So we're on the subject of housing,
Yeah,
I
they'll
guess.
find
So,
an employer that will be willing to keep them at home if that's what they want.
totally. Totally. While we're on the subject, I guess, of housing, let's talk about interest rates, because the biggest, Tony asked about home buyer advice for home buyers. Well, interest rates have risen. They were 2.87%, I think, a year ago right now, and they're at 6% right now for a 30-year fixed rate mortgage. So you can afford a little bit less, or you're going to pay a lot more for the same size house this year as last year. So I guess rapid fire here, you guys, what are each of you thinking in terms of the Fed from what we've seen? I mean, higher interest rates through the end of the year. I'll start with you, Vanessa.
Well, I think we know that they've been really focusing on sort of this long-term cooling of inflation. They've been looking at CPI reports. I think the signal that we're getting next week is there's going to be an aggressive rate hike, and I think that's probably the prognosis until they feel like they've seen enough from data that suggests that that we're really cooling off with inflation. Of course, you mentioned, at the top with your question to me was this rail strike. I mean, that could absolutely be the wild card that could upend everything, especially if it goes on, for a while. But I think the Fed is probably going to remain aggressive for as long as they feel like they need to be in order to really see a pattern of continued cooling when it comes to inflation.
Phil, I know you've watched this interchange between Washington and Wall Street, the Fed, the administration. What are you expecting in terms of higher rates down the road?
Yeah, look, I've been in this game long enough not to predict anything related to rates until we get like the voice of God Wall Street Journal story 4 days before the meeting ends. But I think
Exactly.
that now that the point that we're at a baseline where the next meeting, like 75 basis points is baked in, back-to-back 75 basis point increases is like bonkers to me. And I don't think people necessarily have grappled with that yet. And the reason why I mention that is because White House officials have been very clear. Unlike past administrations, both Democrat and Republican, like they're not going to say a thing about the Fed. They recognize that the Fed needs to do what the Fed has to do. But White House officials who have worked the entirety of their effort on the economic side over the course of the last 19 to 20 months has been to, one, prevent that scarring that we saw in 08, 09, which they feel like they've been successful at, but two, really kind of target the kind of lower quartiles to, if not raise people up, at least keep them floating to some degree through some very difficult times. And they are keenly aware that a soft landing is a very hard thing to hit, and that the people that are going to get hurt when rates increase the way that they're going are the very people that they've really been trying to target their policies toward. Again, you will never hear them talk bad about the Fed or say the Fed should be doing something different than it's doing. But I think that like all economists, they are keenly aware that with aggressive rate hikes, though it's a necessity to address inflation, and I think Chair Powell has been very clear about the realities and the why in terms of pursuing this policy. But there are very real repercussions here. And I think that the White House is very concerned about that from a policy side.
Paul, I mean, I guess just how historic this has been, these rapid rate hikes. And I guess we don't know how long it's going to take for them to start working. I mean, that's the big question. And it's such just a historic moment. I mean, there's no precedent for, oh, here's the formula for how to unwind all of this stimulus, and oh, rates were already too low to begin with. I mean, it's just really just a soup of uncertainty.
Yeah, it is very difficult. I do not envy Jerome Powell or Lael Brainerd or any of the other members of the Fed who sit in these meetings and have to make these decisions, Christine, because again, you mentioned the late Paul Volcker. He obviously had an incredibly difficult job in the 70s and early 80s to try and combat inflation that was historically bad at the time and that we're now making comparisons to. But he had the luxury of doing things not necessarily in secret per se, but you didn't have the focus on the Fed back then at the same extent that you do now, where every single utterance by Jerome Powell and other important Fed members is scrutinized as if it's some sort of biblical importance, and that you have all of these investors that, just on a knee-jerk reaction will make decisions that then impact, unfortunately, what the Fed has to do. Because, I mean, we know that the Fed talks about how they have two official mandates, which is price stability and maximum employment. And that's all about the economy. But what the Fed will never say, even though it's true, is that their third unofficial mandate is to keep Wall Street and other financial markets from freaking out and trying to make them happy. So when Jerome Powell says at Jackson Hole that what the Fed is doing is going to cause some pain, and then the market implodes as a result of those comments, Powell realizes that he probably needs to be a little bit more careful. I'd be very curious next week to see if in his press conference he is not necessarily so optimistic that he's, buoyant about the economic outlook, but if he maybe is a little bit more measured in his tone, it probably would be advisable to not use the word pain multiple times again.
Except you guys,
even if it's true.
But except if you have a Fed that is very concerned about being so far behind the curve for tightening, don't they want higher unemployment rate and lower stock market? I mean, isn't that maybe that was exactly what Powell wanted. I don't know. Go ahead, Vanessa.
I was just going to tie it back to the real world impact, because these are the folks that I talk to every day, kind of tying in what Paul and Phil were saying. I mean, when you have these aggressive rate hikes, that really pushes mortgage rates up. And what we hear from first-time home buyers that have really saved for years to try to buy their first home during the pandemic, mortgage rates were so low, and then they really ticked up very quickly. And just those couple $100 in the amount that it was going to cost every month to pay for their mortgage made a difference in them being able to afford a home and not afford a home. And then these folks are pushed back into the rental market. And the rental market is absolutely insane right now, especially in coastal cities where rents are breaking records left and right. I mean, middle class Americans right now are having trouble finding places to live and finding affordable places to live. So, as we're talking about these interest rate hikes and what the Fed is planning on doing, I mean, there is, some pain that comes along with that when you put it into practice, and the fact that people are just trying to get ahead, they're just trying to buy a home, and they think they can do it, and then just one number moves a little bit and they're out of the game. And folks are concerned. What should they do? They don't know. They're waiting it out like the rest of us.
I know you mentioned rents, and I'm just looking at my notes from yesterday's CPI report, because I broke that on New Day, and year-over-year rent increase is 6.2%, which is not as bad as the grocery number, except rent is non-negotiable. Like the grocery numbers, you've seen people trade down, you've seen them move to different cuts of meat, you've seen them switch. There's some, unless you're the lowest quintile of earner, and as we know, inflation really hurts the poorest people the worst. There's no flexibility for them. But for a lot of families, they're making these changes and trading down. But on rent, you can't really do that. And that, you can't just, flip where you're living over the next week. So I think that rent one is something, the shelter inflation is something that continues to be a problem. I want to read another question, Phil Mattingly from Edmond in Illinois. There are stories about increased profits for CEOs and skyrocketing higher education prices. Okay, two problems, clearly. Is Congress doing anything to investigate and put pressure on companies for unfair practices like collusion and an overall lack of innovation? I feel like there's kind of two questions in there. On the one hand, you had Congress, you had the administration rather step in to forgive some student loan debt. That doesn't solve the problem of sky-high tuition, right? On the other hand, you do have corporate profits that are still strong, and corporate CEO salaries are still very, very good, and companies are able to pass along higher prices to consumers to protect their shareholders. Is there a role for Washington in that, or is that just capitalism?
Yeah, I mean, it's not really a Congress role. Goodness gracious, you don't want lawmakers trying to figure out in the weeds policy things most. No, I'm kidding. But I think the difference right now, I think, than in past administrations, and this, and Christine, you know this very well, antitrust policy has become a really central element of some progressive politics, democratic politics generally, and to be frank, in an area where it actually meshes a little bit bipartisan, and some Republican circles as well. And so, to the extent there's a role when it comes to, when he was talking about kind of collusion, that's not necessarily the word I would use, but in terms of consolidation, in terms of market dynamics and power, you have seen a more aggressive, at least in tone, posture from the Biden administration's FTC, including a chairwoman who comes from a world of being more aggressive on this side of things. The Justice Department's antitrust team has made clear that they want to be more aggressive. So I think that's one area you look at, and I'm not totally sure that I'm getting necessarily the CEO salary part of things so much as I am market consolidation and market power based on a few very large companies. On student loans, look, whatever your views are of the decision to forgive $10,000 for individuals making under 125K or 20,000 if you're a Pell Grant recipient that took out federal loans, you cannot deny the fact that it changed absolutely zero dynamics in terms of the overall cost of education and college. And I think that is, even folks that were enormously supportive of what President Biden did, acknowledge that there is a huge issue and likely a huge bubble here that needs to somehow, some way be deflated. Because frankly, as somebody with 4 kids, I have no freaking idea how I'm going to afford school. So, and I know
Wait,
I'm not
I
the
thought
only
you
one
had
thinking
3
through
kids.
that right now.
I thought you had 3
Oh yeah,
kids. You have 4 kids?
we just had a 4th. Like, it's,
Oh my gosh.
we're Midwest.
Girl or
We don't
boy?
even know. It just kind of happens.
Well, I have 3, and I've been saving in a 529 college savings plan since they were since they were born. And I look at this landscape and I look at this reach school rat race that people are in, where they're trying to figure out how to send I went to a state school and I'm very pro state schools. I don't know about you guys, but I just don't think this bubble's going to pop before I'm actually paying for this tuition. So I don't know how people, I don't know how people do it. And I'm going to learn pretty quickly here how people are going to do it. How old is your oldest, Phil?
7. So we got some time. I'm hoping the entire marketplace just inverts in the course of the next decade.
I just need
And
one
Christine,
electrician. I just need one electrician out of these 3 boys, and I think that will be okay.
I was
Go,
going to say, I
Vanessa.
think your kids may go to the same school. Are they in high school yet? To the same school that I went to in our
Yes,
hometown.
Yes, I have one in your high school. In fact, I just did back to school night last night, and I was thinking of you. If I can have one
good
that
education, I will say.
I know. Well, public schools. I'm all about public schools, all about state schools. Let's talk a little bit more about the federal minimum wage. There's a question here from someone asking if there's any hope of the federal minimum wage increasing. Paul, I'll give that to you. When was the last time they raised it? 97, I think. It's $7.25 an hour, but a lot of states have already done this on their own, haven't they?
Yeah, they have. And I think that's something that we will probably see.
Okay, guys, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but the higher education gods just shut us down when we were complaining about paying for college. I think that might be what happened. I'm just teasing. I really am just teasing. I don't know what happened. We had a little bit of a technical glitch there. But Paul, finish your thought.
Yeah, I think what is going to be very challenging for many consumers right now is paying bills when, as we all know, inflation has raised the cost of just about everything. And you have people with sometimes multiple minimum wage jobs, and that's enough. So even though many states have done a good job of raising the minimum wage, I think it would behoove Congress and the White House to try and work together in order to do something from a federal level. I'm not so naive enough to suggest that Washington's going to suddenly have its kumbaya moment and get something done. But stranger things have happened recently, and Phil can probably talk more about that than I can.
Yeah, Phil, the minimum wage, it seems like the states have really taken, and companies actually have taken the lead on this. I was talking to some executives at Walmart, earlier this year who were saying they'd made all these investments in the front end, which is pay for their workers. and raising their minimums because they just don't want to be this turnover that it costs them to turn people over. So there is a free market capitalist case for the market raising the minimum wage on its own.
Yeah, and I think why this is such an interesting moment, you'll remember there was a huge fight about this at the beginning of this Congress, at the beginning of President Biden's time in office. And I won't take you down Senate procedural rabbit holes as to why it ended up not being able to move through. But the reality was it doesn't have votes, doesn't have enough Democratic votes to be able to move through, let alone 60 votes in the Senate. What's fascinating in this moment, you guys got into this a little bit earlier, is that there is just labor has power now at a level that I don't think we've seen in a long time, and it's not just because it's such a tight labor market. There is and Vanessa is dealing with this right now on a day-to-day basis in Cleveland in terms of you have a very pro-union White House. You have probably the most pro-union president, self-proclaimed pro-labor president in the last several decades, maybe even longer. At the same time, you have these market dynamics that, well, this is not a reflection of whether or not the minimum wage should be raised or not. It is just a very interesting moment to watch how businesses are responding to it, how the private sector is responding to it, but also how unions, which for decades have been kind of decimated, particularly at the state level, have a kind of new sense of power and strength. And I don't think it's a sense. I think it's very real. And we're watching that play out across the country, and not just in this rail issue, and what that means going forward in terms of the relationship between business and labor, which is always a little tense and contentious,
Yeah.
but how that develops and the dynamics play out over the course of the coming years.
Yeah,
But can I
Vanessa,
just say about
let's go
the
through that.
minimum
You've got
wage?
oh, go ahead. But I wanted to ask you, Vanessa, about
Yeah,
teachers, right?
yeah,
Nurses, rail
yeah.
workers, baristas. I mean, right down the line, you're seeing all these industries that are either starting to organize for unions or unions that are getting a little more aggressive.
Yeah, I think we're sort of in the years of the union. I mean, we have Amazon, Starbucks unionizing, becoming successful at that. I just want to just latch on to the minimum wage. The folks I talk to talk about minimum wage and then livable wage. Like $15 an hour for folks is not really a livable wage, especially if you live in a major city like New York or LA or even Chicago. So I just think, we're talking about minimum wage. It'd be great to get it up, to the federal level at $15 an hour, but that's like a benchmark for people. They're like, great, thank you for getting us there. Where can we go? Coming back, to the sort of moment of unions, I think every union is looking at past unions that were successful in their negotiations. If we look at sort of across the industries, we look at Hollywood with the stagehands unions there. They were successful in their fight to get what they want. Starbucks, same thing. Amazon, same thing. Kellogg's workers, same thing. John Deere, same thing. These unions who were fighting against these big companies ultimately ended up getting a lot of what they want. So I think unions are looking behind them and thinking, well, hey, if they got it, why can't we get it? And I think that's what's playing out right now, especially with the rail workers. There's a lot of dynamics at play, but with the rail workers, they feel like, well, wait a minute. We have bided our time. We are at the end of our contract. Why are we going to give up now? We have the power.
Yeah, the rostering, the being on call 7 days a week, and the fact that the rail operators have made so much money during the pandemic. I mean, that seems to be one of the many sticking points
Yes.
here. So let's wrap it up, each of you. I want to talk, I mean, we're 50 some days away from midterm elections. Paul LaMonica, the economic picture is still very murky. The State of the Union is, I don't know, for the economy, but people have jobs, people are still, savings rate still higher than it was pre-pandemic. The stock market's down sharply this year, but that's after being up 20 some percent several years in a row. So give me a sense of the headwind or tailwind of the economy for the midterms, or is it not clear?
I think it's still not 100% clear, Christine, and things are changing so rapidly. It's such a dynamic market right now that think about it. Just a few months ago, and most of the political stories were along the lines of how bad is it going to be for President Biden and the Democrats in November. predictions of, red wave, red whatever you want to use, whatever your noun of choice is for how Republicans could just take much more control in Congress. And now all of a sudden, the president has had some key legislative victories. The job market remains strong. Inflation is still a significant problem for the White House, but obviously the stock market has rebounded from the depths of where it was in the middle of the year. So all of a sudden, I don't think it's as certain. Throw in Roe versus Wade being overturned as well, and what that might mean to get a more energized Democratic voter base to head to the polls. I don't think it's clear anymore that President Biden is in as much trouble as it seemed a few months ago. But again, the caveat is it's September 14th. There's still a lot of time and a lot of headlines to be made between now and early November that could shift the balance in either the left or right direction.
Phil, one of my sources who covers Wall Street and Washington and that intersection was scratching his head saying, I thought the Republicans would be able to make hay with these inflation figures this week, and instead Lindsey Graham is coming out and talking about an abortion limit. Like what? He couldn't believe that they weren't really just zeroing in on inflation in the economy.
Yeah, I texted a Republican pal of mine who's working on a campaign the link to kind of the story about Graham introducing it, and he just responded nightmare, like total nightmare. Look, Paul hits at a great point. Like if you want to know how the midterms are going to end, talk to somebody who's living on November 9th. I have no flipping idea how this is actually going to go. When it comes to the economy, tell me where gas prices are and tell me whether or not there is a trend line of deceleration on inflation, right? So they have an actual story to tell. Again, kind of that Reagan thing. And then the also White House line is, if you tell me where gas is, I will tell you what the University of Michigan consumer sentiment is without fail every single month. So those are, I think, the two critical things on the economy. And I think to Paul's point, the bigger question right now, and I think everybody, the smartest people in both parties are trying to figure out is, does the Supreme Court decision, does the legislative success, do these change what seem to be pretty rigid dynamics, not just in this midterm, but in every midterm, save for a couple over the course of the last 70 years? And I don't think there's a great answer to that yet.
Yeah. And I guess, Vanessa, wrap it up for us. I mean, I guess it's the direction of things over the next 50 days, not necessarily the level of things over the next 50 days.
Yeah, and I think there's certainly so many wild cards. I mean, the war in Ukraine, turned the tide dramatically for the economy. You have this rail strike looming that could change things. I really hate to be doomsday, but you could have a really bad hurricane, hit the south, around anywhere down south, and that could wipe out, anything that has to do with oil and gas, and that could really bring gas prices up. I just think I'm sort of with all you guys, like I'm not predicting anything. So much can change, but I think that the things to look at are where are we with inflation, and then the Roe versus Wade situation, is that going to play 50 days from now?
Yeah, we'll have a lot to talk about. Hopefully we'll be able to do it again. Everybody, thanks so much for joining me. This has been a great Citizen by CNN conversation, even with our technical glitches. Everyone keep saving for college, especially Phil Mattingly. We'll set up a GoFundMe for Phil and his kids. You can register for next Wednesday's Citizen Policies that Impact the Midterms. That's going to be 7 Eastern. That's Casey Hunt moderating. It's a conversation with Gloria Borger, David Chalian, and Jasmine Wright. It's going to be fantastic. Have a great day. Thank you, everybody.